He hadn't stepped foot in that town in over a decade, yet here he was in a rented black suit that fit a little too well, sitting alone at the very last table of a wedding he hadn't wanted to attend. No one greeted him when he walked in. No one asked if he was doing well. If it weren't for the white name tag folded beside his untouched champagne glass, you'd think he'd crashed the wedding. But he hadn't. He was family. Not close family, but enough that when his mother called, her voice trembling between guilt and expectation, he'd booked a ticket home. Elliot wasn't bitter. Not anymore. Bitterness required fuel and the fires had long since burned out. What remained was something quieter, a kind of distance carved out not by anger, but by years of quiet exile. This wedding wasn't about him, and it never was. It was for his younger cousin, the girl who used to braid her dolls next to his sketchbooks on the porch, and Blake Connor, the groom. That name had a weight to it. Even now, even after years of therapy and successful book deals, Elliot felt it settle in his chest like a cold coin. Blake had been the golden boy quarterback. Homecoming king, full scholarship, and a jawline sharp enough to carry cruelty without consequence. In high school, Blake didn't just tease, he humiliated, he led chants. He threw slurs like confetti. Once he pinned Elliot against a locker and whispered a word so venomous that Elliot didn't eat for 2 days after. Now that same Blake was marrying into Elliot's family. Life had a dark sense of humor. The reception hall was decorated in soft golds and creams, strings of fairy lights looping above the dance floor. Elliot's table far in the back had a partially wilted centerpiece and 5 empty chairs. They hadn't expected him to come. He hadn't planned on coming either. But something in his mother's voice had stopped him from saying no. Maybe it was the way she said, "It would mean something if you were there." Maybe he wanted to see if the people who had erased him could still recognize his face. He wasn't the boy they remembered. He had built something of himself piece by piece in the quiet corners of the world they never bothered to look into. His children's books filled with gentle animals and messages of kindness had won awards. One had even been translated into 6 languages. Yet none of that mattered in this room. Here he was still Elliot Monroe, the gay cousin no one quite knew what to do with. They hadn't put him at the singles table, nor with the family. They had placed him with the forgotten, an old aunt who left early, a neighbor who didn't show up, and 3 empty seats assigned to maybe guests who turned out to be it was a message dressed as a mistake. He looked toward the front where the bride and groom laughed with relatives he didn't recognize. Blake looked older, but not smaller. He carried himself with the same confident posture, the same practiced smile. Elliot noticed the slight tension in his jaw when their eyes met, just for a second before Blake looked at it, as if seeing Elliot confirmed a memory he'd hoped would stay buried. The DJ called for the first dance. Applause filled the room. Elliot didn't clap. He simply sat there, hands folded on the white linen, watching a scene play out like a movie he had seen before but never understood. He had come not for closure, not for forgiveness, but maybe for proof. That he could be present without disappearing. That he could exist in the same room as the past and not fall apart. The lights dimmed, the couple danced, laughter echoed, but Elliot's gaze drifted, not toward the stage, but to a memory sharp as glass, a hallway, a locker, the word freak etched into the metal, and Blake's voice behind him, unrepentant. That same man was now smiling in a tuxedo, one hand on his bride's waist, the other waving to the crowd. Elliot had survived that boy, and now he was about to see what kind of man he had become. For more stories that reveal what's hidden beneath the surface, subscribe to Hard Stories. We tell the ones they never expected you to survive. The night wore on, but Elliot's wine remained untouched. He didn't come to drink, he didn't come to dance or reconnect. He came to observe, quietly, carefully, the people who once taught him how to disappear. From his corner of the room, he saw everything. The awkward small talk, the polite laughter, the sideways glances. But mostly he watched Blake. There was something strange in the way Blake smiled that night. It wasn't insincere, but it wasn't whole either. It was the kind of smile someone wears when they're being watched too closely, when they're trying to pass some kind of test and not quite sure of the answers. Elliot had known that smile. He used to wear it every day in high school. It tightened slightly when Blake leaned in to kiss his bride's cheek. It faltered when the best man made a joke about Blake, never really being the emotional type. And it almost vanished entirely when the photographer asked the couple to kiss for the camera again. Blake obliged, but only after a pause, just long enough for Elliot to notice maybe no one else did, maybe no one else wanted to. Elliot shifted his gaze, unsure what to make of it. He had spent years untangling his trauma, rethreading the narrative of his youth so it didn't end in bitterness. He didn't want to assign meaning to every tick in Blake's body language. People changed, people moved on. He wasn't here to relive the past, but the past, it seemed, had other plans. It started when Blake kept glancing in Elliot's direction, not directly, but just enough to betray nerves. Once while the maid of honor gave her speech, Blake looked so intensely at the back of the room that the bride actually nudged him. He turned away quickly, covering the movement with a sip of champagne. Then came the microphone. The DJ announced it was time for the groom's speech. The room hushed, silverware clinking to a stop. Blake stood, straightened his tie, and took the mic. His bride smiled up at him, her eyes wide with anticipation. Blake's first words were expected. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked his parents for their support, the bride's family for welcoming him in, and his friends for standing by him. Even when he was a pain in the ass, a few laughs, a few claps. But then, without warning, Blake's voice cracked. Not from emotion, but from hesitation. "There's someone here tonight," he said, looking not at the crowd, but past them. "Someone I didn't think would come. Someone I owe more than I've ever said." The room fell quiet. Blake adjusted the mic, swallowed, and continued. "When I was younger, I thought strength was about how loudly you could speak, how hard you could hit. I thought it was about control, about hiding anything that made you feel different, vulnerable, afraid." He paused. His bride glanced at him with a confused smile. The groom's party shifted in their seats. "There was this boy in school," Blake went on, "who was everything I was taught to fear, not because he did anything wrong, just because he was unafraid to be soft, and I hated that." Elliot's stomach dropped. "I hated it because it reminded me of everything I was too afraid to admit. One night when I was 17, I drove out to a club in the next town over. I told myself it was a joke, just to prove I wasn't like them. But I went in, and when I came out, there were two guys waiting by my car. They didn't like who they thought I was. The entire room was still. No forks moved, no glasses clinked. Only Blake's voice remained low and steady. I would have ended up in the hospital or worse, but someone stopped their car. Someone I didn't recognize at first. He pulled them off me, got me into his back seat. I was bleeding. Scared, he didn't say much. He just drove, took me to the ER, waited outside while I got stitches. Then he was gone." Blake looked directly at the far table now, straight at Elliot. "I never told anyone, not even my wife, not until now, because the person who saved me that night is here. And I owe him not just my life, but my truth, because that night made me face who I was and who I didn't want to be anymore." The mic trembled slightly in Blake's hand. His voice softened. "Elliot Monroe, you didn't have to stop. You didn't have to help. Especially not someone who treated you the way I did. But you did. And because of that, I started becoming the man I am today." Gasps whispered through the room. Elliot didn't move. He couldn't. Blake turned back to the crowd. "So if you take anything away from tonight, let it be this: strength isn't in how loud you speak. It's in how quiet you listen. And sometimes the person you feared the most is the one who saves you." He set the mic down. There was no applause at first, just stunned silence. And Elliot, sitting beneath the soft hum of fairy lights, began to feel the past shift, just slightly. Not erased, not forgiven, but altered. This wasn't the speech anyone had expected. Least of all him. The applause, when it finally came, was slow and scattered, more reaction than celebration. People looked at each other, then back at Blake, then toward the back of the room where Elliot sat motionless. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a beautiful speech. It was the kind that follows a confession, one that rearranges the room. Elliot felt the weight of 100 glances settle on him like dust. Some were curious, a few surprised, but most carried a quiet discomfort, as if people were now being forced to consider something they had spent years ignoring. That there was a life behind the jokes, that the boy in eyeliner and secondhand sweaters had been real all along, and that maybe he had mattered more than they thought. He didn't stand up. He didn't nod or wave or perform any gesture of acknowledgement. He just sat there, breathing through a surge of emotions he couldn't yet name. He hadn't come for this, and certainly not for recognition. There had been a time in his life, too long a time, when he would have given anything to hear his name spoken like that, to be seen. But now it just felt strange, not unwelcome, but unfamiliar. Like finding a photograph of yourself that someone else took and realizing they captured a version of you you never meant to show. Elliot hadn't told anyone about that night either. He had buried it beneath dozens of other nights, all shadowed by fear or shame or silence. It was a page in a book he'd refused to reread, but hearing it aloud, hearing Blake confess it not as a joke or half-truth, but in full pulled something loose, the memory returned in fragments. The way Blake had curled in on himself in the back seat, cradling a bleeding lip. The way his hands shook as he tried to explain to Elliot why he was even there, why he couldn't go home. The panic in his voice when he whispered, "No one can know." Elliot had only said one thing in reply, then heal fast because secrets like this rot from the inside. He hadn't meant it to be wise. He had meant it as a warning. A truth from someone who had already rotted enough on his own. After dropping Blake off at the hospital, Elliot had driven 2 towns over, slept in his car, and skipped school for 3 days. He couldn't risk seeing him. Couldn't risk hoping it had changed anything. Because back then, hope was more dangerous than hate. When he did return, nothing had changed. Blake walked the halls like always, laughed like always, and looked through Elliot like he wasn't there. There had been no nod of thanks, no apology, no recognition, just silence. And Elliot, exhausted, had taught himself to forget, to file it away with all the other times he had made himself smaller to make others comfortable. So hearing it now spoken aloud in front of everyone felt less like validation and more like excavation. As if Blake had reached into the past and yanked the memory into the light, demanding it be seen for what it was, a moment of shared pain that neither of them knew how to carry. But why now? That question gnawed at Elliot as the dinner resumed. Blake returned to his seat. The bride kissed him with affection, but also with subtle confusion, as if unsure what had just happened. Conversations resumed, but not the same ones. The air had changed, tables buzzed quietly, eyes occasionally darting toward Elliot before looking quickly away, and Elliot, still seated at the edge of it all, began to wonder if the speech had really been for him or for Blake. Because if Blake had truly come to terms with who he had been, why had it taken him until his wedding day to say it out loud? Why here? Why now? The timing felt theatrical, and Elliot had lived long enough to know the difference between sincerity and spectacle. Maybe this was guilt. Maybe it was a performance disguised as redemption. Or maybe it was the only way Blake could finally let go of the boy he once pretended not to be. Elliot didn't know. He wasn't sure he wanted to. But what he did know was this: Blake's words had shifted something, not just in the room, but in him. No longer felt like a ghost at the edge of his own family. He felt undeniable, like a presence no one could politely ignore anymore. And that in itself was enough to keep him sitting there, still composed and quietly powerful, as the rest of the night unfolded around him. He had come to be a witness, and now, without lifting a finger, he had become part of the story. The rest of the night unfolded like a page half-turned. The music played, the servers moved from table to table with practiced grace, and the newlyweds danced under the suspended lights like nothing had shifted. But something had. The air carried it, the sideways glances confirmed it, and Elliot, still anchored to the same chair in the far back, could feel it in his spine. For years, Blake had been the symbol of everything. Elliot wasn't allowed to be masculine, admired, unquestioned. In high school, Blake's existence had come with built-in applause. Elliot's had come with whispers behind locker doors. He was soft where Blake was sharp, quiet where Blake was loud. And yet, all these years later, it wasn't Blake's bravado that lingered in the air. It was Elliot's stillness. There had been a time when Elliot believed strength meant survival, that being gay and being safe could not exist in the same sentence, so he carved himself into something small and palatable. Not flamboyant, not loud, just quiet enough to slip by. He learned the art of dimming, of folding himself into shadows so that others could keep pretending. But survival is not the same as living. And in that moment, surrounded by people who once reduced him to a single word, Elliot realized he had stopped surviving a long time ago. Somewhere between the book signings, the mentorship talks, the letters from young queer kids saying, "Your story made me feel real," he had stepped into something larger than survival, something closer to self-respect. Still, none of that could fully shield him from the question sitting in his gut. Why did Blake speak now? He didn't know Elliot redemption. Elliot hadn't come looking for it, but there was something unsettling about being used as someone else's breakthrough. As if Blake had handed Elliot's story back to him, rewritten in his own voice, edited for emotional impact. A single speech could not undo a decade of silence, nor did Elliot want it to. What Elliot wanted, what he had always wanted, was something far quieter. Not a spotlight, not a public apology, just a room that didn't shrink when he walked in. It was during this swirl of thoughts that the bride approached. She wasn't dramatic, no wine glass in hand, no tears threatening to spill. She stood in her gown, simple and composed, and asked softly, "May I sit?" Elliot nodded. For a moment, she said nothing. Just looked out across the hall where Blake was speaking with relatives, laughing too hard at something someone had said. Then she turned back to Elliot. "I didn't know," she said, almost a whisper. "Not until tonight about any of it." Her voice didn't carry blame, only weight. Elliot didn't speak. He wanted to let her fill the space with her own understanding. "Not protect her from it. I used to think he was strong because nothing ever rattled him," she continued. "But now I wonder if maybe he was just never asked to look in the mirror." That caught Elliot off guard. Not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. She wasn't looking for reassurance. She was reconciling something on her own. "You were the first story he ever told me that didn't center him," she added, "and he waited until today." Her words weren't bitter, just matter of fact, like someone telling the truth. Elliot finally spoke, his voice calm. "He's still learning. Most of us are." She gave a small nod, stood up, and before walking away said, "You deserved better back then, and you deserve better now." She didn't mean romantic affection. She meant presence, visibility, the space to exist without apology. As she returned to her husband, Elliot felt no anger toward her, only a strange kind of respect for recognizing the invisible gravity he'd carried into the room. That was the irony, wasn't it? The boy they mocked for being too sensitive, too soft, too much. He had held the weight of all their shame for years without crumbling, while the ones who threw stones were only now learning how to face their own reflections. And for all Blake's public contrition, Elliot had never needed a microphone to feel brave. He had done the hard work in silence and therapy, in solitude, in choosing love. In a world that rewarded self-erasure, courage wasn't in the speech, but in the act of showing up, of staying seated, chin up, while a whole room turned toward a truth they had tried to ignore. And in that act, Elliot reclaimed more than his past. He reclaimed the present. He didn't announce he was leaving. He didn't wait for the cake or the bouquet, toss, or the sparkler exit. Elliot simply stood, tucked the name card into his coat pocket, and walked toward the doors with the same quiet dignity he'd arrived with. But this time he wasn't walking in as the boy they once erased. He was walking out as the man they couldn't unsee. Outside, the sky had darkened into a soft velvet gray. The last of the summer light had dipped below the trees, casting the parking lot in a hush of dusk. Elliot exhaled slowly. The kind of breath that doesn't just leave the lungs, it leaves the past. He reached his car and paused, not to look back, but to be still. There was a certain power in choosing when to exit a story. For years, Elliot had believed closure required confrontation, apologies, redemption, arcs neatly tied in bows. But sometimes healing looked more like stillness, more like walking away when you're ready, not when someone else tells you you're allowed. He slipped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine hummed to life. A voicemail buzzed on his phone screen, his mother likely checking if he was okay. He didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, he looked at himself in the rearview mirror. There he was. Not the boy in the hallway, not the outsider at the back table, but a man who had faced down everything that tried to reduce him and stayed whole. There were no witnesses to this moment, no applause, but Elliot knew its weight. He had been the one to step into a dark parking lot all those years ago to pull Blake off the ground. He had been the one to say nothing when it would have been easier to scream. He had carried the silence, the shame, the story alone, and now he had placed it down. As he pulled out of the lot, headlights sweeping across the rows of cars, he saw a group of younger guests still chatting near the entrance. One of them, maybe a college friend of the bride, caught his eye and gave a small wave. Elliot hesitated, then returned it with a nod. That was enough. Back in Brooklyn, he would return to deadlines, to early mornings with black coffee, to storyboards, and publishers and kids who looked for themselves in his illustrations. He would wake up to light through the window and know that the weight he once carried didn't follow him home. But tonight he had done something quietly defiant. He had made them look. He had shown up without armor, without vengeance, without apology. And in doing so, he had left a mark not on the party or the photos, but on the silence they once used to erase him. Before turning onto the main road, Elliot finally pressed play on the voicemail. His mother's voice filled the car, small and unsure. "Hi, sweetheart. I saw what Blake said. I didn't know everything. I just want you to know I'm proud of the man you've become. You've always been stronger than I ever realized. Call me when you get a chance." He smiled faintly, letting the words settle. She wasn't perfect. Neither was he. But maybe now they could begin again. Not in the shadow of what had been, but in the truth of who he had become. As the road stretched out before him, quiet and open, Elliot didn't feel like he was running away. He felt like he was finally going home. What does it truly mean to be seen? Not just looked at, but known. And how many of us are still waiting for that moment to come? If this story moved something in you or reminded you of a time you had to reclaim your voice, share it in the comments. We read every word. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more stories of quiet strength, hard-earned dignity, and the kind of courage that doesn't always make noise, but changes everything.